This jobs market has been white hot for several months. And whether you are looking to find a better paying job or a job with better benefits, it has been your world for several months. But we always knew this employees market was going to come to an end at some point. And are we starting to see those cracks now? I have invited Senior Economist from Glassdoor, Daniel Zhao, to come in and talk all about it. Daniel, thank you for your time.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, so right off the bat, where are we in this jobs market?
I actually think the way that you put it is perfect. We are still in a white hot job market, but it looks like things are cooling down a little bit. So maybe instead of white hot, we're now transitioning to red hot. This is still a job seekers market. There's still a lot of opportunities out there. Employers are still desperate for workers, but things are definitely cooling down. And it looks like on the horizon, there are some potential economic storm clouds.
Okay, we're going to talk all about that in a second. But before we get there, I want to ask you, because I get this question all the time. People who are in their jobs, when I say wages are up, they're saying, well, I'm not getting a pay increase at my current job. Why is that?
Well, I would say that the biggest reason is because the wage increases are largely for people who are switching jobs. So this is something that we see during good times and bad. People who switch jobs are generally the folks who are seeing the largest wage increases. And so you've probably heard stories, maybe friends who switched jobs, saw a 10% raise, 20%, 30% raise, well above inflation. But generally, it's folks who stay at their current jobs who just aren't seeing the same pay increases keeping up with the market rate.
Okay, so you mentioned switching jobs, and I have been reporting basically since last September this incredible quit rate that we have been seeing. 4 million Americans quitting their job every month, which is sort of unprecedented. Is it still safe to quit your job right now?
It's a good question, because even though the market is still hot right now, there's no guarantee that it'll stay that way. And of course, there are kind of two ways to think about that. On the one hand, maybe that makes folks a little bit more apprehensive about switching right now, but it also means that if you try to switch later, you might not get the same market, you might not have the same opportunities and the same opportunity for wage growth that you do if you would switch right now. So it is always a little bit of a risk making that move. But at the same time, I think there are pros and cons. So it's really just about trying to make an informed decision, trying to see like, okay, is this job that I'm switching to one that's stable, one that's secure? Is the company really a company that I think is going to do well, even if the economy turns down? Those are the considerations that folks need to take into account.
When you are considering jumping jobs, I've heard that it's typical when you are the newest person into a company, you are oftentimes the first one to be laid off or let go. Is that fair to say still?
It definitely depends on the company and it depends on the situation, because during the Great Recession, we also saw some cases of the opposite, where some companies actually laid off older, more experienced workers because those workers tend to be more expensive. They tend to be higher paid. And we saw some companies actually replace them with younger and quite honestly, cheaper workers. So it's not a given. It's not a guarantee that that's exactly what will happen, but it is definitely something to keep in mind. And so that's why I do encourage people who are looking for a job right now to really think about whether the companies they're going to are ones that are secure, stable, are jobs or are companies that aren't out over their skis in terms of their financials.
Right. Speaking of that, I have heard we've seen reporting actually for the last probably 2 or 3 weeks now that big companies, Netflix, Meta, big companies, tech companies, and some other traditional type companies have started to pump the brakes on hiring. So what I mean by that is over the last, since we came out of the pandemic, really, companies have been desperate for workers. There are all of these, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, millions of jobs that are open and not enough workers to backfill those positions. And what we have started to see in the last few weeks are these companies saying, I'm cool on letting these jobs stay open for right now, or I'm going to pull back on hiring. Is that a knee-jerk reaction to the possible looming recession?
Yeah, I would say that most companies, when they feel like the economic winds are turning, they don't want to try to hire more people because, quite frankly, people are very expensive. Workers are very expensive for companies. And so that's always a time when the company takes a step back and just thinks about like, okay, do we still want to keep our hiring plans exactly the way that they were before? That's not the same thing as layoffs. So for example, in certain sectors, like in cryptocurrency, there's been a ton of layoffs. And I think that's more about the financial health of those businesses as opposed to some of these other companies that are just kind of reading the economic tea leaves, taking a step back and saying like, okay, well, instead of hiring this many people, like maybe we just bring that number down a little bit. So some of those companies you mentioned, for example, Meta, they're still planning on hiring 7,000 engineers over the next year, which is a reduction from what it was before, but that's still an enormous number. So it's always useful to think about these things in context. There's some companies that are doing better than others. And so even if there is a slowdown, there definitely still are opportunities out there.
Yeah, that's a really, really good point. When I mentioned that they're pulling back from sort of this historic hiring, run that these companies have been on, that doesn't mean that they're like seizing up the job market,
Exactly.
correct? Okay. Yeah. I want to also talk about the unemployment rate. So a couple of things have been going on since the pandemic, sort of we've come out of the pandemic. One, unemployment is basically at a near record low at 3.6%, right? That is, incredible.
Mm-hmm.
There are millions of jobs that are still open. And I want to talk a little bit about what that looks like if and when a recession comes. Should people start expecting or thinking about that unemployment rate starting to go back up?
It's a little bit circular because the definition of a recession is kind of loose. Like there's not a hard and fast mathematical rule that says we are in a recession now or not. And one of the things that the committee that decides whether or not we're in a recession takes into account is employment and unemployment. So it's very rare to have a recession where unemployment does not rise because that's part of the definition of what a recession is. So if we do see a recession, it does depend on whether it's mild or severe, how long it lasts, what industries it affects. But I would expect to see unemployment rise as a result, in part because that's quite simply just the definition of what a recession is.
You bring up a really interesting point about what a recession is. And sort of there's this committee that looks at it. Sometimes it's in hindsight and says, oh yeah, 3 months ago we were in a recession. And I wonder, is it possible that we could have really low unemployment, but actually be in a recession due to the extremely high inflation? Could that be possible?
It's theoretically possible. Like I said, the committee looks at a whole host of different factors. They're looking at production, they're looking at consumer spending, they're looking at employment. And even a pretty small increase in the unemployment rate, let's say from 3.6% to 4.5%, that could correspond to a recession. And now, granted, I say that that's a pretty small increase, but that is still hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people. Sure. So, I do want to caveat by saying that even a mild recession can have a really significant impact, both on people who are laid off and then also people who are still in their jobs, because a weak economic environment means that you have less negotiating power to get a raise, less ability to actually go out and find a better job or a better opportunity. So even a mild recession can be really bad, but at the same time, like I don't necessarily want to get too caught up in the definition of a recession, because I think there are a lot of folks out there right now who feel like the economy is not working for them, most likely because of inflation. Inflation is really high. That means gas prices, food prices are going up, and that feels really bad economically. That doesn't necessarily mean we're in a recession, but at the same time, that's not a good economic situation for people to be in. So there's a distinction between what people are actually experiencing on the ground versus this kind of very technical definition of what a recession is.
Right. And you bring up the wage thing, which I think is really interesting, because we have seen wage increases. I think the last number was something like 5% in May. Wages were up over the year before. And though we are seeing wage increases, and I've reported on this, people aren't feeling it because of the inflation. So when does that start balancing out? Does that only start balancing out when inflation drops out, which could mean a recession? And then all of a sudden, what we got these higher 5% higher wages, but so what? We're in this recession.
Yeah, it's a really tough situation because I think a lot of people don't necessarily realize that inflation is often because the economy is running too hot. There's too much demand and not enough supply, which, when you think about the job market, like a lot of demand and not enough supply generally means that workers are getting these larger wage increases, they have more leverage. And so these two trends often go together. But that also means that if we want to get inflation down, that often means slowing down the economy, which by extension often slows the job market as well. And so because inflation is so high right now, I think there might actually be, unfortunately, a period of time where we're waiting for inflation to come down and wage growth is still below the level of inflation. So there's kind of a period where we have to wait and see kind of what the trajectory of inflation is, but still folks are getting those paychecks eaten up by the higher cost of living.
Right. All right. And I want to end this sort of where we began, which is if you were talking to, and you are talking to millions of people right now about what they should be doing or thinking about in the next, say, 3 months, is it wise for them to stay in their current job and hang on to what they've got? Or is it a time right now where they can still gamble? And at what point does that gamble not pay off?
Well, I would say that people can take educated risks, right? It's really important to do your research on what kind of job or what kind of company you're going to. And that's even more important now when the economy is kind of on uncertain footing, right? So that means doing your research. That means going to sites like Glassdoor and figuring out more about what a company pays, what the culture is like, asking friends and family and people in your network kind of what opportunities out there and getting kind of some of that back channel information, right? So doing that research is really important. It's even more important right now. And I would say, just taking off my economist hat for a second, I think that people are often very wary of taking risks and making job switches, making career changes. And I would just encourage people to actually think about, what the positives are. I think a lot of people get stuck on, this is a big risk, that this is something that I haven't done before. And they don't realize that there actually are a lot of opportunities out there that might be a better fit for them. And they don't necessarily see like the possible benefits of making those changes. So taking off the economist hat and just encouraging people to take some educated risks.
What would you say are the things that they should be looking for when they make those research decisions? What things would say, you know what, that's a good company that I think would be a safe bet for me to get a better wage and better benefit?
Well, it really varies because everybody feels differently about what is important to them. So of course, pay is really important, benefits are really important. So just looking at the data sources that are available out there, whether it's Glassdoor, whether it's other sources, just trying to get an understanding for what the average pay is at that company compared to the market rate. But I would say that culture is really important too, because of course, like if you're getting paid a lot, but you're just miserable every day, that's not a good situation to be in. Right. So again, whether it's looking at Glassdoor or asking friends, family, people in your network, like those are people you can trust and really try to understand what the true culture is behind the scenes.
Should you be looking at, the financials of that company, and if they're a company that's sort of running beyond their means, because then that may indicate that they may lay you off or, rescind your offer?
Yeah, I would say it is important right now just to think a little bit about the health of the company. So if they're in a sector that is really prone to, doing poorly during a recession, then that might be a company to stay away from, even if their financials look pretty good. On the flip side, if they're in an industry that does pretty well, but their financials are terrible, well, you probably want to stay away from that company as well. So that's also a place where, again, relying on your network, asking people to give advice on, do these financials look good? Does this industry look good? Just trying to get as much information as possible is really the key to taking those educated risks.
What sectors would you say are pretty good sectors to feel comfortable about switching your job in this market right now?
It's tough to say because I think there's still a lot of uncertainty about, well, if a recession is coming, like what is actually going to cause it? So there's definitely a lot of folks who are saying, well, the tech industry has been doing poorly, but even within the tech industry, if you're talking about, say, the crypto space, well, there have been a ton of layoffs in that part of the market, but at the same time, you still have plenty of other tech companies that are still hiring very aggressively and still growing and still are looking for tons and tons of workers. So there is a little bit of a balance there. I would say it's not necessarily universal, but maybe another example is like housing. Because the housing market is slowing down because interest rates are going up, that is a case where you are seeing some layoffs in the mortgage industry. You might expect to see a slowdown in, say, real estate and construction. But on the flip side, you also have industries like tourism and e-commerce that are actually still doing very well. Consumer spending is still very healthy. And so you do have companies in those spaces that are still ramping up their hiring plans.
I know you already took off your economist hat, but I need you to bring out your crystal ball right now. I need you to tell me, when do you think this employees market, meaning the employees sort of has the upper hand here in terms of the job market? I want you to look into your crystal ball and tell me when you think that employees market is going, at what point in 2022 do you think it's going to shift into an employer's market?
I think there is some evidence that the job market is slowing. So even if it doesn't shift all the way to an employer's market by the end of the year, the balance of power is shifting. And so that means that, instead of having 5 offers in hand, maybe a candidate has 3 offers in hand. Or maybe instead of 2 offers, you have 1 offer. If you only have 1 offer, it becomes a lot harder to negotiate on those wages, right? Even if it is still a better opportunity for you. So I would say that I do think that things are going to slow down through the rest of the year. That's definitely what policymakers have been signaling. I will give kind of an optimistic take, which is that
I need it, Daniel. I need something optimistic here.
Yeah, it's not a guarantee, but I do hope that companies look at the experience that they've had over the last 1 to 2 years, the Great Resignation, these labor shortages, and they really take to heart the lesson of how important it is to actually retain and engage their employees, because they've seen how difficult it can be to hire, how difficult it can be to retain, and how expensive, honestly, it is for companies. So my hope is that, if there's a recession, if there's a downturn, companies come out of it on the other end, realizing how valuable employees are and really try to get back to a world where they're really investing in their employees as much as possible.
Absolutely. Daniel, thank you for your time and your expertise. It has been enlightening.
Yeah, thank you. It was a pleasure.